Okay, hello again. We are back yet one more time. This is, I believe our 8th DVD in the series. And what we're going to do now is we're going to transition. So at the end of the talk on scales or psychological inventories, one of the things I talked about was how a benefit of using a more standardized instrument is it was easier to compare across different people. And we are now sort of moving from, if we started with single subject and very microscopic look with self-monitoring, and then we sort of moved into a little more macroscopic and a little more possibly comparable among different people, goal attainment scaling and A/B. And then we talked about doing scales, which work very well for one person pre-post or pre-during treatment and post. And also you can start collecting different people and comparing them because they're all on the same sort of stick or inventory. You know, these are everybody's scores on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, everybody's scores on the Enright forgiveness inventory. We're now going to move from looking sort of mostly at how one individual client is working or not working towards their goals or is making the changes in treatment, to actually let us intentionally gather data from a variety of people and put them together and say, is this intervention working on a larger number of people? So first of all, let's just talk about what are some of the benefits of studying more than one person at a time. The drawback, of course, of studying more than one person at a time is that you lose the beauty of the individual. You lose all of the idiosyncrasies, and you lose the wonderful level of detail you get on any one person. However, because any one person is incredibly unique in every possible way, if you do an intervention and it works wonderfully with one person, it's really very, very hard to tell if it will work with someone else. So even as we talked about when we discussed those lovely ideas of causality and threats to internal validity, even if you really know as well as you can that it really was your intervention which led to the outcome, you still have the question of, and will it work for more people than this one person? So if I know that it was, the cognitive behavioral therapy that I did with this client that really led her to overcome her depression, but this is one African-American, lesbian, 18-year-old female who lives in poverty, can I take a similar CBT approach with a 27-year-old Hispanic male, and will it work as well? How do I know? Well, we don't. We can do a single subject on our first client. We can do a single subject on our second client. And when we collect a bunch of single subjects, we can start putting them together. However, it's easier to do that if we're using as our outcome measure something which is a more standardized tool, such as a depression inventory, such as an anxiety inventory, or something like that. So one of the things that gathering information on more people says is my treatment more robust? Is it more reliable? Can I start to generalize beyond one person to multiple people? And if we gather information from a lot of people, and it looks like the people who got this intervention got better, more so than the people who didn't get the intervention, then we can say, it really looks like the intervention works, and not just idiosyncratically for one or two, but it really looks like it has a broader scale approach. And that, in essence, is what we want. If I, as a clinician, know that my intervention works really, really well for, Susan Jones, but I haven't a clue if it works for anyone else, that's not very good information. Whereas if I know that this treatment works for the average individual, or works for most women over 50, or works for most men with less than a high school education, that's very helpful, valuable information for me to have when I figure, there's a zillion different possible treatment modalities that I could use for any client in my office. It's good to know this has some evidence that says that it works for many people like this client. And that's sort of the whole idea behind evidence-based practice, is that you choose something which has a track record that says this intervention, more often than not, works better than most others for this kind of client with whom you are working. So choose it over choosing one which is sort of undocumented and unproven. And that's the reason why, if you have a a treatment intervention that you are absolutely wedded to and you know works beautifully, but it doesn't have any documentation, why it would be really good for you as a student or a social worker to study that, to do some of this stuff we're talking about and gather that information, because if nobody gathers it, your modality may fly out the door just because there's no data, not because it doesn't work, but because there's nothing that really indicates and documents that it does. So we move from single subjects to larger subjects. Well, sometimes also when we are working, we don't really just want to have, Sally walks in the office at this time, and Sergio walks in the office at that time, and, Mark walks in the office at this time. And I treat each of them on an individual, unique basis. And they're all simply worked with whoever happens to walk through the door. Sometimes an agency will say, there seem to be a lot of people in this community with this particular problem. And maybe it would be good to develop a program to work with these people. So for example, in Walla Walla, there is an agency called Friends. And the Friends agency has a program which hooks up responsible, hopefully psychologically fairly healthy adults with kids who need a healthy mentor, parent figure / friend. And the purpose of their being there is because there are a lot of kids, especially single parent kids here in the Valley, who really desperately are lacking a healthy adult figure in their life. So instead of Friends just sort of being an agency that's called Friends because, hey, it's a friendly title, and anyone walking in off the street who might be feeling a little bit like, I need a friend, it specifically targets a need that the Walla Walla Valley has. And if this is what your need is, you call Friends. And if you need food, you call Helpline. And if you need a place to sleep, you call Christian Aid. So different agencies have different purposes. And sometimes one agency has a variety of different purposes or programs it meets. But a program really sort of specifies, as I have here, what is a program? It's often got a target audience or target issues that it looks at. It's got specific goals, so that the Friends program specific goals are to sort of work with and help kids who need a healthy adult role model to form connections, to engage in leisure time activities, to learn, good ways to spend time after school, to just have someone with whom they're connected and who cares about them and is an adult and can sort of look out for them. Let's say that we were to go into the schools and find that many, many kids after school, and sort of a commonly tossed around statement in our society is more teenage kids seem to get in trouble between the hours of 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon than at almost any other time. And some people will say more teenage kids become pregnant between 3 and 5 in the afternoon than any other time. Well, why is that? Because a lot of parents are at work all day long. Their kids get out of school somewhere between 2:30 and 3:30. Parents start arriving home at 5 or 5:30. Kids have this afternoon, very little supervision. What do? Well, they do a lot of things that perhaps get them in trouble. You look at the Walla Walla area, you say, wow, there's a lot of unsupervised kids just sort of roaming the streets and hanging out and getting into trouble in the afternoons. Maybe we could develop a program to help these kids, to give them something structured and something fun and something that isn't like, oh, what a dweeby, stupid idea that is, as my 13-year-old would say, but something that's actually, hey, this is a cool thing to do. So sports programs in school very often really fill that niche. It's something to give kids purpose and meaning and school spirit and all sorts of stuff, and it keeps them busy in that time until mom and dad got home from work. So there's lots of different programs. When I was working at the homeless shelter here, a concern that many people had was there's no place for homeless teenage kids here in Walla Walla. So their parents can go to Christian Aid, and little kids can go to Christian Aid. And teenage kids have a hard time having a place to go, especially, let's say you have a woman in a domestic violence relationship. She goes to the YWCA. They, at some point, age out boys, or at least years ago they used to, in which case mom could move into the YWCA shelter with her 7-year-old son, but perhaps not with her 15-year-old son. So what does mom do? Does mom leave her 15-year-old son out on his own, find a friend to take care of him, say, sorry, honey, you got to sleep on the street, put him on a bus and send him to grandma's in California? Or does mom not go to the shelter? Or you just have a kid who can't live at home. What does the kid do? You know, mom and dad are living in separate places. They're drinking and drugging. Mom's boyfriend is sexually abusive. Teenage daughter, 13, 14, 17, runs off. She has no place to stay. Does she go home to a toxic environment? Does she live on her own? A program with specific audience, teen runaways or homeless teens, specified goals, safe place, structured activities, help with homework, help with finances, help to becoming independent, building bridges between families where things might not be too toxic at home. A program is sort of a specialized thing with specialized goals to fill a need or a hole or a service gap that a community is perceived in having. So one of the things about programs is, and as I have here, often one agency will house several programs. One of the things which is nice about developing a program is that many times if your agency needs money and you want to get money from this lovely thing called a grant, and a grant kind of is free money. And we'll talk in the next DVD about how free is like free in quotes, not free. Nonetheless, it is money for which sort of comes with strings attached. Nonetheless, it is free in many respects. And sometimes it's lots of money. Sometimes it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And grants rarely fund what's called general operating expenses of an agency. You can rarely write a grant that says we would like to pay for the building, we would like to pay for all the salaries, we would like to pay for the lights and the heat, etc., etc. Grants don't like to do that, but they often will fund a program. And sometimes within the program, they will fund salaries, they will often fund transportation, they will fund training, and lots of things. So sometimes your agency can develop one or more programs. The programs can apply for grant money, and then you have a way to fund needs of special individuals in the community. So let's say that you're working in an agency. How in the world do you come up with the idea that you need a program? A program should be driven not because your agency decides it wants to apply for a grant, because wouldn't free money be great to have? Ideally, a program is developed because you identify a service gap in the community. So as I said, when I was working at Christian Aid here with homeless adults and families, some of the people there really noticed that, you know, if a 17-year-old young man or woman walks in and says, I have nowhere to go, we have to say, I'm sorry, until you're 18, we cannot take you. And some of the workers at Christian Aid turned away a good number of teens and really felt very badly about that, knowing there really wasn't a better place to send them. So that was seen as a service gap. If you see that there's lots of kids just sort of running around the community after school with absolutely nothing better to do with their time than get into trouble, is there something that somebody, one of the schools, one of the agencies in town, that someone could do, create, that would be a cool, fun after-school activity that would be appealing to a lot of kids, that they could go to from whenever they get out of school until somewhere between 5, 6, and 7 o'clock at night? So ideally, you identify a service gap. And that's what drives the program, not we want some money, so let's postulate or hypothesize or come up with some goofy idea just to get the bucks. If you identify a service gap, at that point, if you're thinking about writing a grant, you might say, I wonder if there's any grants out there which would fund a shelter for teens, which would fund a pregnancy prevention program, which would fund after-school activities for kids, which would fund whatever it is that your program is. Ideally, the next thing you want to do is you identify this looks like a service gap. But this is your eyeballs and your ears that identify this. And then you talk to your colleagues, coworkers, and they say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I've seen the same concern. And then you talk a little bit broader, and it turns out that a lot of people seem to think this wouldn't be a bad idea, and as a matter of fact, it might be a good idea. To go from sort of this informal identifying of a service gap, before you actually write a grant and before you actually start opening a new program, a really good thing to do is a needs assessment. A needs assessment is a kind of formal, and it can be less formal or more formal, but it's ideally, and if you want to write for big money, it is a fairly formal assessment to decide whether the community has a need and would support this particular program. And having a need and whether the community would support it are two different things. Sometimes there's a screaming need, but it doesn't mean that the community wants to support it. For example, let us say, in probably almost any community in America, there are, and especially a place like Walla Walla, where you have a penitentiary, there are sex offenders in the penitentiary. Sometimes they get sent in Washington State, I believe it is, to McNeil Island. From the pen here or from McNeil Island, people get released. Some people think it would be helpful to have a halfway house. And years ago, there was a strong proposal to build a halfway house for sex offenders released from McNeil Island to help them reintegrate into the Walla Walla community. Nobody argued that there wasn't a need. These guys are going to come out of prison. Their release date is X day, and it would sure be better for them to live in a halfway house than to just go into the community unsupervised. Nobody argued that there was a need. At the same time, the community really was not highly into supporting such a program. And this comes into oftentimes what people refer to as the NIMBY syndrome. And those of you who are unfamiliar with NIMBY, this stands for Not in My Backyard. So while we all appreciate that a program for sex offenders who need to rehabilitate, a program for people who are leaving alcohol and drug detox, a place for people with serious and persistent mental illness to live, there's a lot of programs that could be very valuable to the people who need them. And there's no denying that there's a need. At the same time, when it comes time to buy a building or build a building, all of the neighbors are up in arms. Not in my backyard. I do not want those people, whoever those people are, living in my neighborhood. And I think all of us, to a certain extent, are very guilty of this. And it puts us in this pickle as social workers, because while on the one hand, we want to see everybody be given a fair shake in life and good opportunities. In the other hand, when you, the parent of 5 children, have the thought of having the halfway house for sex offenders be 2 blocks away from where your children live and right across the street from the park where your children play, you suddenly find yourself crying NIMBY as well. It's a real pickle, and social workers feel it more because we kind of see both sides more than perhaps others do. But so part of the needs assessment is to see, is there a need? And another part is to see, is there community support? If we agree that there's a need, will the community support having this? Because you don't want to have a screaming need and really be going forward and then have the community, we cannot have this particular service here, and it all comes to a screeching halt when you're already halfway out. So we identify a service gap, we do a needs assessment. I'm going to go into much more detail about a needs assessment in just a few minutes. You would then sort of propose or develop a program, at least sort of partially in your head. You talk to people, you bring in a bunch of, experts and so forth if possible. You become more and more formal with this. This is the point where you go and you formalize, let us get a grant proposal. And a grant proposal, what you're looking for is a thing called an RFP. This is a request for proposal. This is the document that comes out from the people who have the money, who are looking to give the money to people providing service, you look through these RFPs for people who will be interested in funding the program that fills your gap or your niche. You then write the grant, and when you write the grant, part of what you need to do is to keep in mind, how am I going to evaluate how well this program is working? It used to be decades ago that in order to get a grant, you needed to document need, and you needed to document that you had a really cool, innovative idea for a program. Those are the olden days. In modern times, you have to show there is a need in my community, we have an idea for a really cool, innovative program, or for a sort of best practices or evidence-based program. We're going to take this evidence-based program and put it on our community and just put maybe our own little special spin or molding on it to make it fit our particular population. And we're going to show you at the outcome, we're going to tell you how we're going to let you know that it was effective. So in order to get the money in the first place to run the program, especially if we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars, most grant proposals these days, you have to say, and this is how we're going to let you know that the program is or isn't working. So what is the impact of the program? Is the program running according to protocol? That's called formative evaluation, and we'll talk about that more in the future. Did the program have the desired impact on the community and on the clients that we hoped? That's called summative evaluation. And oftentimes you need to include both of those before you ever get the money in the first place. So there is a documented need. Here is our very cool program, and here's how we're going to evaluate it to let you, the funders, know whether it is or isn't working. And that's sort of what goes into developing a program and applying for some sort of monies to get a program. Now, if you have a very rich benefactor who just pours tons of money into your agency, you don't need to scrounge for grants, you don't need to do all this documentation. Very cool. However, most of our agencies are very happy to get sources of funding from anywhere that we can, and many, many agencies have someone, large agencies have one or two people who their whole job is going out and scrounging for grants and writing grants and figuring out where the money's come from, and that is that's what pays their paycheck, is their ability to keep the agency afloat by having all of the different grants and contracts coming in. So, and this is for those of you who have heard the term soft money. Soft money that an agency runs on refers to this idea of grants, and it's called soft money because it's not really very guaranteed. And as we'll talk about in the grants lecture, grants are often here today and they're often gone tomorrow. And so people whose livelihoods are paid for through grant funding often are never quite sure, well, I have this job for a year and then the grant runs out, and if we can't get another one to replace it, this job or this program may disappear into Never Never Land. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the free money from grants. But let's go now to needs assessment, because this is sort of the first thing that you want to do. You've identified that there's some sort of service gap. And now that we've identified a service gap, let us see formally, really, is there a need and would the community be supportive? So for the purposes of just discussion here, let us say that we are going to look at developing some sort of after-school program for middle and high school age kids. The community does, I think, a pretty good job between the Y and Campfire and I think some of the schools in having after-school programs for grade school kids. But by the time you get into middle and high school, that seems to be a harder program or a harder niche to fill. What I have listed up here are a variety of different avenues that you can go through to gather information about, is there a need for this particular service? Not every need assessment needs to use all of these areas. Some will use one or two, some will use all of them, and this list is not absolutely exhaustive. but it is a fairly thorough list. And if you do a needs assessment, you want to include probably several of these different forms. So let's sort of talk about them, what they are, and what are the good things about them and what are the drawbacks. Key informants. This refers to, generally speaking, professionals who have some experience in the field that you are interested in. So key informants for an after-school program for kids. If you think about who knows what kids do after school, well, that's maybe part of the problem. Who knows what kids do after school? Who would you talk to? Well, one thing you might talk to is teachers. Teachers at least have a sense of what kids do during school, and some kids might talk with teachers about what they do after school. Police officers may know what kids do after school because they may be the ones who take the calls. Counselors may know what at least some of the kids who are identified as sufficiently troubled do after school because that may be how it is that they got into counseling. You may talk with, if there are community programs, you can talk with them about the kids who are in programs and maybe about kids who aren't in programs. But you kind of want to brainstorm who are the people who would know about what kids do sort of after school and before mom or dad gets home in the evening. And those would be your key informants. And for this program, key informants, yeah, it might be sort of helpful, but it might not be as helpful as it could be. If, let's say that you were doing a teen pregnancy prevention program, key informants there might be very, very beneficial. You could talk with hospitals about pregnant teens. You could talk with OBGYNs. You could talk with people at Planned Parenthood. You could talk with teachers. You could talk with counselors. There might be a whole lot of professionals who would know something about pregnant teens, because when a teenage girl becomes pregnant, it is often a crisis, and generally she has to interface some other person at some point to figure out, oh my goodness, how am I going to handle this? And so there are probably a number of professionals who would know about that. What kids do after school and before parents get home, teens and parents might know that more than anybody else, and they don't really fit into key informants because this usually refers more to professionals. Surveys. Surveys are what surveys say. So this is sort of sending out or distributing in some way, shape, or form a paper and pencil, or you could do it on the internet if you could somehow figure out a way to get it to people. But pick a target population and send out a survey form in some way, shape, or form, electronically or paper and pencil, to people saying, you know, what do you think about kids after school? Or what do you think about having a program for kids after school? If you choose to do a survey, A, make sure that you hire somebody or that someone in your agency who actually knows something about crafting a survey does it so that it's done fairly well. Then you also want to say, well, who is my audience? And with surveys, you can have one audience or you can have several audiences. So if you're doing an after-school program for teens, one audience might be teens. If I want to develop a program that middle and high school age kids are going to think isn't, oh my goodness, this is like the most lame thing on the planet, you're probably going to want to ask the kids, what in the world would you want to do after school that would be more attractive than going over to your girlfriend's house, doing drugs, and having sex until her folks get home? That might be a hard thing to try to compete with. But what would kids like to do after school that would be appealing to them? What is it that they do after school now? So you could send surveys to kids. What would be the best? So then if you decided, okay, we're gonna survey teens, then how do I want to survey them? Well, you could go into the schools. If you could get permission, you would get a wonderful large audience. If teachers would give you, time, you go into every social studies class and administer surveys to everybody. You get a wonderfully large participation rate, and you could survey here in Walla Walla, Wahai, DeSales, and Wava. You get and I don't know if Liberty in town here has high school. I think it's just Wava, DeSales, and Wahai. You're going to get the vast majority of kids, at least kids who are in school. You're not going to get the kids who have dropped out of school. But if it's an after-school program, you're probably targeting kids who are in school already. So surveying kids might be really helpful. And then, do you want to do it face-to-face? Would it be better to send them something through email? If you email a survey, it comes back with an email address, which isn't anonymous. You might not want to get that. So you'd probably want to assure teens their confidentiality and their anonymity on a survey. You might also decide surveying parents. It's really important. It might be that teens would tell you that what they want in this after-school program would be a very large screen TV and beer flowing freely. Well, okay, but the beer part is illegal, and the widescreen TV, and maybe they want, all sorts of rated M video games with all sorts of blood and gore and shooting. That would be what kids would come to. Well, maybe their parents would think that was worse than what it is that they're doing now. So you might want to send surveys to parents. What is your understanding of what it is that your kids do between school and when you get home from work? What would you like to see if there was a program that you would feel comfortable sending your kid to and you think your kid would actually go to? What would that program look like? So you could survey kids, you could survey parents, you could survey whomever you thought was worthy of being surveyed, and you might want to send the kids sort of one tailored for them, the parents one tailored for them. Benefits of surveys are that you can reach a lot of people. They're standardized, as we talked about, with standardized tests. Surveys are also standardized in that they're all, at least all the teen ones are similar, all the adult ones are similar. You can compile it, crunch it in a computer, come up with some findings pretty quickly. Drawbacks of surveys are, well, you only get answers to the questions that you ask, and that's true of sort of any standardized instrument that's closed-ended, or the specific questions. Another problem with surveys is that very often response rates on surveys is really pretty low, which is why going to the school could be very helpful for getting them from kids because you've got a captive audience. You try to get a teenage kid otherwise to do a survey, could be a challenge. How are you going to get parents to do a survey? You could send it out through the Union Bulletin, the local newspaper. You could invite parents to a thing at the school. You only get the parents who show up, and that is a small self-selected group of parents. So part of the problem with surveys is how do you distribute them? How do you get them back? And then there is a certain amount of cost involved in the photocopying, if it's a face-to-face survey, in the interview time and so forth. So there's some expense problems, there's some low return rate problems if you just sort of slam everybody through the mail and hope to get things back. And if you get a low response rate, then you have to say, are the people who sent them back in some way fundamentally different from the people who didn't send them back? Let us move from surveys to community forums, because this is similar in terms of that concern. Community forums are, you advertise that at a certain place or certain places, at a certain time or certain times, we are going to talk about this new program. Please, if you have any interest whatsoever, show up. We'd love to know your opinion. The better you advertise, the more people who know about it, and the more convenient the time and place, the likelier you are to get a good turnout. So with community forums, as with social indicators, the biggest problem is just getting people on both ends of that sort of normal distribution, the people who care passionately for and the people who care passionately against, and you kind of may miss everybody in the middle. So it's an extreme groups kind of thing. Going back up here, social indicators are sort of the statistics oftentimes that other people have gathered that you can get, from census data, that you can get from the internet, that you can get from surveys other people have done and published. Here in Walla Walla, every year I think one of the local, like Blue Mountain Action Council or someone, hires some surveyors from the community college to go out and do some sort of survey of the status of kids or families or something in the Walla Walla Valley. And they go out and do X amount of hundreds or thousands of interviews with people, and then they publish this little book that used to at least be a pamphlet that was packaged in a blue binder. And it got all sorts of informations on, poverty rates and hunger rates and, all sorts of possible needs. Kids who are on free and reduced lunches in schools and, how many kids pass the WASL or whatever the information was. So if you're wanting to show that kids after school tend to get into trouble, you could look for social indicators. Well, how many kids here in the Valley, let's say, get arrested? How many kids go to juvie? If you could have specific data on arrest records between 3 in the afternoon and 6 or 7 at night, which is when your program would run, if you could show that the vast majority of kids who are arrested tend to be between those hours of the day, that would be a wonderful social indicator that a program like this would be very valuable. So you think about, what are statistics? You could gather information on latchkey kids. They don't tend to call them latchkey kids by the time they're in middle or high school, but what are the number of kids who live in single-parent families or two-parent working families where kids come home and there is no adult there? And so if that's 5% of kids, you're not going to sway a lot of people with deep pockets that this is a community that desperately needs an after-school program. If it's 80% of kids in your community come home and there is no responsible adults around until 7 o'clock at night, that says this is a community which really has a need for some sort of healthy, structured activity for children after school or for older kids after school. So those are social indicators. Compare with other communities. Let's look at another community that opened a similar program to ours but isn't ours, and did it work? So let's say we go down to Pendleton, and Pendleton didn't used to have an after-school program, and this is what their rate of kids being picked up for drug offenses was, and here's what their rate of kids being picked up for vandalism was, and here's what their rate of kids being picked up for some sort of assault offenses were, and here's what the rate of teen pregnancy was. And then they started a program in 2003. And from before 2003 to after 2003, these rates have slowly dropped off as more and more kids have participated in the program. Well, those are nice indicators that, if Pendleton had a big problem with, kids sort of roaming the streets, getting into all sorts of trouble after school, and then they developed this really nifty, cool, fun program, and a lot of people went to it, and youth crime problems just evaporated, that says if it works in Pendleton, maybe it can work here. Now, if Pendleton opened a program, no kids ever came, shut down, it didn't make a difference, then Walla Walla might say, well, what leads us to think it's going to work here if it didn't work there? And sometimes you can answer that question, Walla Walla is quite different from Pendleton in many ways. Or sometimes you say, didn't work there, it didn't work in Spokane, didn't work in Moses Lake, didn't work in Richland. Why do we think it's going to work here? Bad idea. So that's what comparing with other communities is. Focus groups. Focus groups are small, gathering a small number of people, oftentimes hand-selected, together, usually somewhere 8, 10, 12, 15 individuals. You have a leader who knows something about leading a focus group, who has a list of specific topics to cover, specific questions to ask, usually about 8 to 12 members in a focus group, about 8 to 12 questions relevant to the topic, and the leader just sort of tosses the question out to the group, generally tends to audio record it and get a transcription of the entire session verbatim, and just says, so, talk to me about this, let's talk about what kids do after school. And then just leads a discussion and tries to help everybody participate, everybody have input. And with focus groups, you can do 1, you can do 5, you can do however many you want. And as I said, you often hand select the people. So you could do a focus group of kids. You could do a focus group of parents. You could do a focus group of cops. You could do a focus group of the staff at juvie. And sort of see what the different constituencies have to say. And then you could maybe do a focus group of a few of everybody all peppered together. These give you really nice, rich, qualitative information. People kind of feed off of one another, so what this person says makes me think of this, and what I say makes the next person think of this, and it really can be a very, very wonderful idea-generating session, as well as just sort of data-gathering things. So these can be very helpful, and you usually want to have some enticement for people to come. So often, free dinner if you tend to be broke, pizza, if you tend to have more money, cater in a nice meal or something like that. I've been invited to several marketing focus groups, just random telephone call calling me out of the blue. and they sometimes pay as much as, $10 an hour, $50 for the morning, or I think one was going to offer me $100 for the morning. That's really nice money that social workers often don't have, but free pizza and Pepsi might not be such a bad idea either. Testimonials are people telling you their story. Testimonials is probably the most questionable of the things up here on the needs assessment, which I just realized is missing a couple letters here. With testimonials, you want to think about who your audience is. For some people, the testimonial is the most powerful tool in your needs assessment. This is the story. This is you go and you talk to, the kid who tells you, after school there's just nothing to do, and I really don't want to be the kind of kid who gets in trouble, but I'm just not very good at saying no. And so, I had a couple kids who asked me, to come with them, and I went with them, and they were doing drugs, and I just couldn't say no. And I know if there would have been something to do, I didn't want to do it, but I said yes, and then I was high, and then I ended up getting this girl pregnant, and I really don't want to be a father at the age of 16. Oh, I've gotten myself in such trouble, and if only there'd been an after-school program, I know my life would be different. Oh, it just breaks your heart, and that's a testimonial. They really sway some people because it makes it real. This other stuff, especially like, statistics, social indicators, is all very impersonal, very number, very, yeah. But it doesn't touch people's heart. Testimonials really can touch people's heart, but some people really don't want their heart touched. They want the numbers. So you need to judge who your audience is on your needs assessment as to, will this strengthen my proposal or will this weaken my proposal? And that they're going to say, oh, it's all that touchy-feely stuff, and we want hard data. We want the above things. So kind of use this with some judgment. But these are, as I said, a variety of different ways. And then you package all this information. You get data from any or all of these sources. And you package this information to sort of answer the question, does the community need this? Does the community want and support it? And when it comes time to applying for a grant, and I've been to multiple trainings where people have talked about how to get a grant, and many people will tell you one of the foremost things that people who are giving the money away are looking for is, does this community really need this money? So that if you have, let's say you get 500 proposals and you're down to the top 10 and you need to choose 5. One of the things that will push yours into the 5 that are chosen as compared to the 5 that don't get funded is, how needy is my community? Is this the community where 95% of the kids come home and there is no responsible adult parent figure there until 7 or 8 o'clock at night? This is the community where there are high rates of teenage crime. A lot of those crimes happen after school. You talk to the kids, and the kids are absolutely bored to tears. There's nothing to do here. I wish there was something to do, but after school there really is. We are just bored, and this is how come we get into all sorts of trouble. A lot of people showed up at the community forum. It was a very strong push. Yes, this would be terribly valued. The focus groups came up with some nifty ideas of how to do a program, and the testimonials just touched your heartstrings in a very powerful way. You've got a lovely needs assessment. The people on the funding side say, these people have done their homework, and this community really, really would benefit from this program. And that's hopefully the one that gets funded, and hopefully that's you. And that is kind of program development needs assessment. In the next DVD, we will go into more detail about finding and writing a grant and what isn't quite as free about the free money. And this is the end of number 8.